Hello, my name is John Berresford, and thank you for choosing a pumpkin patch, a typewriter, and Richard Nixon, the Hiss Chambers espionage case. This case has been a hobby of mine, some of my friends would tell you an unhealthy mania, for many years, and in these videos I hope to give you some of the fascination and thrills it's given me. This is a story about two men. It's also about law, politics, hunches, trust. It's about friendship, ideals, and country, loyalty to those things, and the betrayal of those things. And it all works through these two men, and one of them is a great patriot, and the other is a great liar, and the question is which is which? The two men are Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. Both men agree that they knew each other for a few years in the 1930s at the dawn of their professional lives. Something happened between them, and that's the mystery, and then they parted. And about 10 years later, they were both very successful in their chosen careers. They were dragged back together and forced to relive what they'd done in the 30s amid scandalous publicity. And what happened ruined both their lives, launched the career of a future president, and opened a new era in our political history, one in which fear of homegrown communist traitors was common. Who were these two men? Well, both were born around 1900 into families that shared two traits. The first is that the families were what used to be called shabby genteel. They had seen better days. Neither family had ever been wealthy or socially prominent, but they'd been solidly middle class. And in the generation of Hiss's and Chambers' parents, they went down a few steps. Hiss grew up in Baltimore, Chambers on Long Island. Second, each family was what is now called dysfunctional, extremely so. They both grew up in an Emilia of an absent father. Hiss's father killed himself when he was 2. Chambers' dad was apparently a bisexual alcoholic who would disappear with new girlfriends and boyfriends from time to time. Their siblings displayed mental illness, suicide, death at an early age, and alcoholism. Chambers' childhood home also featured a crazy grandmother. I think both families were held together by sort of iron butterfly mothers. The great journalist Murray Kempton wrote a lot about this case, and I will quote or paraphrase him often in these videos. He wrote that among the shabby genteel, the average runs alarmingly towards strong widows with promising sons. And both Hiss and Chambers were promising, highly intelligent boys with very rare natural gifts, but each of them seems to have reacted differently to the traumatic childhood. Hiss decided to follow what Kempton called the code of shabby gentility, to work hard, get ahead, and restore the family's good name. He attended Johns Hopkins University, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, editor of the college newspaper, president of the dramatic club, and president of the student council. He went to Harvard Law School, where he was on the law review and was a favorite student of then Professor Felix Frankfurter, later a great Supreme Court justice. One of Hiss's fellow students at this time wrote that he had a kind of physical grace and distinction that had to be seen to be believed. You might mistake him for the British ambassador. Professor Frankfurter got Hiss's first job after law school, which is the kind of job, or the job that probably every American law graduate just dreamed of in those days, and that was secretary, we would now say law clerk, to Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the greatest judges in our history, then I think approaching 90 and still going strong. This was in 1929. The same year, Hiss married a divorced woman named Priscilla Hobson, who came from an Illinois Quaker family that moved to Pennsylvania when she was 4. She had been to Bryn Mawr College on Philly's fashionable main line for her bachelor's degree and took some courses towards a master's at Yale and got her master's at Columbia. She'd had a previous marriage that produced a son named Timothy and ended in a Mexican divorce. Mrs. Hiss was highly intelligent, obviously, but apparently she was also something of a scold. She was the kind of person who, if you said, "Gee, isn't it a beautiful day?" would snap at you, "Well, it's not a nice day for the sharecroppers in Mississippi." And you'd want to say, Prosy, could we take it down a little bit, please? A lot of Alger's friends did not like her. The night before Hiss married her, Hiss's mother sent him a telegram that simply said, "Do not take this fatal step." After the Holmes clerkship, Hiss worked briefly for 2 prestigious law firms, one in Boston and one in New York. And it was in New York, Murray Kempton wrote, that Hiss first showed signs that there was something more to him than just the hyper-ambitious son of shabby gentility. In New York, his wife Priscilla joined the Socialist Party. Hiss was affiliated with something called the International Juridical Association, which was a group of labor lawyers with a radical left-wing impulse. And according to Kempton, both Alger and Priscilla attended lectures together at the Socialist Party's nighttime Rand School in Union Square. And Kempton said, "They must have been such a strange sight, the bright young man from the Wall Street law firm and his Bryn Mawr wife walking up the steps of the Rand School, rubbing shoulders with the Robespierres and Dantons of the garment workers' unions." He wrote, and I'm quoting now, to think of them there is to abandon any thought of these two as typical of their time and their condition. The impulse which brought them to this foreign colony almost cries out in its loneliness and isolation. So perhaps under the superachiever there was, in Alger, a pilgrim soul of romance, Kempton guessed. One of his biographers wrote that Hiss was sitting in a taxi on March 4th, 1933, when he heard President Roosevelt's wonderful first inaugural address. And he said Hiss was transfixed by this. He received a telegram from his old professor, Frankfurter, who said, "You and all the bright young things in the country have to come to Washington. Leave your jobs at the big law firms. Come to Washington, help save the country in the New Deal." And that's what Hiss did. He came to Washington in May 1933. And he was, you might say, a New Deal wonder boy. First, a lawyer for an alphabet soup agency called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Then, at the age of 29, the sole attorney for a Senate committee chaired by Senator Nye that investigated the profits made by armament companies in World War I. Then briefly in the prestigious Solicitor General's office, which argues cases before the Supreme Court on behalf of the U.S. government. Both Hiss and Chambers agree that sometime around the middle of 1934, when Hiss was working for the Nye Committee, the two men met and got to know each other. And the question is, what did they do together? Well, in September 1936, Alger Hiss joined the State Department, and everyone said, "Ah, home at last." Alger was born to be in the State Department. He seemed to have been born in a Brooks Brothers suit. He entered as a personal assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, Francis B. Sayre, who was the son-in-law of former President Wilson. Sayre's principal focus, and Hiss's, was commerce between the U.S. and foreign countries, us selling our stuff to foreign countries, them selling their stuff to us. As time went by in the State Department, something seemed to go out of Hiss. He became less the New Deal wonder boy and more merely proper. Very, very proper. I've spoken with a lot of people, or several people, who knew him in his State Department years, and they all say he was, kind and considerate and generous, but the words they all use are stuffy and pompous. Pompous in a State Department sort of way. Someone who knew him well once wrote to me. And during World War II, Hiss became one of the State Department's experts in planning multinational organizations. Towards the end of the war, Hiss began to appear in the public eye ever so slightly. You've probably seen photographs of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sit around that big table in Yalta and they draw the map of the post-war world. In many of the pictures behind the president, there's a bright young man handing him papers and telling him things, and in many of the pictures, that is Alger Hiss. He had all the briefing papers that were handed to the president. He took minutes at a lot of meetings. It seems to me that he did more than just carry the president's briefcase, and he may have had some minor input on some decisions, but he was not a major policy maker for our side. It's conceivable that everything that happened at Yalta would have happened even if Hiss hadn't been there. But of course, just having the president's briefing papers, knowing what issues we care about, knowing what we'd be willing to give up and what we're going to hold hard on, would be very valuable to any foreign country. If you don't think that's important, let's play poker for $1,000 a point, and I get to see your cards and you don't get to see mine, and at the end of the game we'll see if you still think that's not important. After Yalta, Hiss went almost immediately to San Francisco for the April conference that founded the United Nations. He was the Secretary General of that conference. You could say that he was the first Secretary General of the UN. The John Birch Society used to say that the UN is the house that Hiss built. and he was universally praised for his poise and efficiency at handling the thousands of details that had to be attended to, with diplomats coming in from all over the world and translations and mimeographs and hotels and security. And at the end of the conference, he had a brief moment of public glory when he was photographed taking the UN Charter from San Francisco back to Washington to present it to President Truman. Life magazine was a big deal in those days, and they used to have something called the Picture of the Week. And here in the July 16, 1945 issue is the Picture of the Week, which is Alger Hiss and the UN Charter. He used to quip that the Charter had a parachute, but he didn't. In December 1946, Hiss left the government, and there were two reasons. One was that a troubling number of claims were being made that he was a communist, or worse still, a secret agent of the Soviet Union. Who were these sources? Well, around 1940, the French Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, told our ambassador in France that Alger Hiss and his brother Donald were Soviet agents. In the fall of 1945, a defector from the Soviet embassy in Canada, a man named Igor Guzyenko, stated that an assistant to Secretary of State Stettinius, and that's what Hiss was at that point, was a Soviet spy. Also, in the fall of 1945, an American defector from the Soviet underground in this country named Elizabeth Bentley said that she had heard Hiss mentioned as a fellow Soviet agent, although to be fair, she thought that his first name was Eugene. And finally, Hiss had been named as a secret communist as early as 1939 by Whittaker Chambers. That's 4 independent sources, not to be lightly dismissed. Hiss was also found to have accessed secret State Department documents that he wasn't supposed to see. So by 1946, the file on Hiss was getting uncomfortably thick. He found himself marginalized within the State Department and denied access to some kinds of documents. The claims against him were not courtroom quality kind of claims, but he couldn't disprove them. How do you prove that you're not a secret agent? And the other reason that Hiss left state was that luckily for him, he was offered and accepted a new job. And that was as president of a think tank about foreign policy called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he started there in January 1947. Now, the Carnegie Endowment was no hotbed of communism. The chairman of the endowment's board was John Foster Dulles, who later became Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. And its board included such establishment luminaries as the ultra-conservative Democrat John W. Davis, General Eisenhower, David Rockefeller, and Thomas Watson, the man who made IBM into a great company. Well, in 1948, when the scandal broke, Hiss was there, living in Greenwich Village with his wife and their 7-year-old son, Tony. Mrs. Hiss's son by her previous marriage, a guy named Timothy, was then 21, and thus Alger Hiss, still looking pretty young at 44. And in the next video, we meet Hiss's one-time deadbeat subtenant, or his best friend, but certainly his nemesis. He was a man who went by many names, the most famous of which is Whittaker Chambers.